Colonel Charles Close of the Royal Engineers became Director General of Ordnance Survey in August 1911, and he immediately set about initiating a revival in the department's fortunes at both a scientific and a technical level. Civilian staff numbers were increased, and a review of pay and conditions was initiated. Tests of the Victorian triangulation network were undertaken to validate its quality for 20th century mapping, and work was started to place the geodetic levelling framework on a new, more scientific footing. In Ireland, the 1 to 2,500 scale survey was finally completed, and in Britain a new focus was given to revision of urban maps to support growing requirements for land registration and land valuation. Advances in cartographic design were initiated with the aim of producing a new series of the 1-inch to 1 mile map. In an effort to protect Ordnance Survey's finances, the first ever legal case for infringement of Ordnance Survey copyright was brought to court and won by Ordnance Survey. Nevertheless, Ordnance Survey was conscious of the growing threat of war. Across Europe, the great empires of the late 19th century, Germany, Austria-Hungary, France, Holland, Britain, Turkey and the Ottoman Empire, and Tsarist Russia. Many had overseas territories and colonies in Africa and the Middle East, and increasingly they did not sit as easy bedfellows. Indeed, it had only been 12 years since Britain had been in a colonial war with the Dutch Boer settlers in South Africa, where many of Ordnance Survey's military staff had served. A European political crisis in 1912 had raised concerns, but the events of July 1914 in Sarajevo were to trigger the first ever global war. Once Germany had invaded Belgium, a nation created in the early 19th century with its neutrality guaranteed by the 1839 Treaty of London, Britain, as a signatory to the treaty, would inevitably have to act. At the outbreak of hostilities, Ordnance Survey was one of the best placed public bodies in Britain to respond to war. Among a staff of over 1,200, almost 350 were serving Royal Engineers. However, the demands of war were immediate, and within weeks 16 of Ordnance Survey's 20 serving military officers on the active list were transferred to the British Expeditionary Force and deployed to France. Within a year, 322 of the 326 Royal Engineer warrant officers, NCOs and sappers were deployed to active service, and in the same period, 623 of the 808 civilians eligible for military service had also enlisted. The early departure of the officers was eased slightly by the appointment of 6 retired officers in their place. While Ordnance Survey staff well understood the demands for and the challenges of meeting high map production and supply during wartime, initially the view of the British High Command was that the war would be short and decisive. The "it will be all over by Christmas" mentality meant that initially there was totally inadequate provision of mapping support in France. This quickly changed following the retreat from the disaster of the Battle of Mons, where the inadequacies of the available French 1 to 80,000 scale mapping quickly became apparent. When, at the Battle of the River Aisne in September 1914, the German army discovered the defensive and destructive power of men in deep trenches armed with machine guns, the pattern for a static, trench-based war of attrition, in which artillery would be a major factor, became set out. This new mode of industrial warfare required industrial strength mapping. At first, the new French 1 to 50,000 scale maps, but quickly a demand for the 1 to 20,000 scale, small enough to cover an adequate area behind the trench lines on each side to encompass field artillery batteries, but detailed enough to show the full topography of the battle zone. In November 1914, the first Ordnance Survey unit was deployed to France, the 1st Ranging Section Royal Engineers, under the command of Captain, later Brigadier Harold Winterbottom. This unit was initially focused on establishing enemy artillery positions by surveys of the flashes from the guns. Winterbottom's survey skills and an uncanny ability to locate enemy guns led him to being given the nickname the Astrologer. With the advent of wireless telegraphy ranging, this section and others, which had later been deployed, expanded their role as ranging and survey sections, and in 1915 they concentrated on creating the new 1 to 20,000 scale map of the whole front. In 1 month, Ordnance Survey plane table surveyors mapped the entire British sector of the front at 1 to 20,000 scale, covering a distance of over 40 kilometres from Ypres to Bethune. As the war developed and the strength of the British Army grew, so did the deployment of surveyors and mapmakers. The first Ranging and Survey section grew initially into 3 self-contained topographical sections, one attached to each army of the British forces, and each capable of producing and printing its own maps. Later, Royal Engineers field survey companies were established to work alongside the Ordnance Survey's survey companies, as they had by now become. During the later years of the war, tasks included continuous revision of the 1 to 20,000 scale map, often by surveyors in exposed positions under enemy fire, to reflect the advances and retreats of the opposing forces. New maps were also published at the 1 to 10,000 scale of some of the more strategic salients and defensive lines, and increasing use was made of aerial photography. From simple and rather unsuccessful beginnings by the Royal Flying Corps in 1914, the development of more sophisticated graphical photogrammetry and photo interpretation techniques enabled significant additional information to be abstracted from the images by the later years of the war. These included trench depths, locations of trench mortars, and even the movement and massing of enemy troops for imminent attacks. Until 1917, save for small numbers of updated maps required in the GHQs of the various army commanders and printed by the local survey companies, the bulk of the demand for printed maps was satisfied by a supply chain which brought new survey information to Southampton for compilation and printing at Ordnance Survey's London Road headquarters. The resulting maps were then shipped in bulk to France overnight. However, the growing need for urgent availability of new revised mapping at the front resulted, in 1917, in the creation of an Ordnance Survey overseas branch, initially located at Wardrec, near Saint-Omer, and later at Aubagne, near Boulogne. Almost 150 Ordnance Survey staff were located with the overseas branch, 46 of them women, and their production output was phenomenal. When the German offensive on the Somme began in March 1918, Wardrec produced over 300,000 maps during the last 5 days of March, from 6 quad-demi printing presses working continuously 24 hours a day. The maps were shipped to the front line in motor vans, which were often exposed to enemy fire themselves as they picked their way through the devastation of Flanders. By the end of the war, Ordnance Survey had printed almost 33 million maps. Over 1 million of them, involving 2 million impressions, were printed by the overseas branch alone. The achievements of these printers in France was marked by a tour of the site by Princess Mary in late November 1918. The legacy of the First World War for Ordnance Survey was considerable and varied. At a personnel level, 69 Ordnance Survey men had fallen or would imminently die of their wounds, with casualties in all three services and across all theatres of war. Ordnance Survey was gifted a captured 4-ton 105mm German field gun as a trophy of war, and in recognition of its artillery-ranging exploits. This was placed on display in front of the main South Range at London Road until, ironically, it was destroyed by the German Luftwaffe in the November 1940 Blitz. Despite sterling efforts to maintain some mapping activity on the home front, within Britain and Ireland during the war years, such as the construction and monitoring of the new tide gauge at Newlyn in Cornwall from 1915, the loss of manpower to the war effort and post-war austerity meant that Ordnance Survey had to shed civilian staff while at the same time welcoming back returning combatants. As a result, by 1920, the large-scale mapping of Great Britain was in a bad state of repair in terms of its currency. The small-scale maps derived from this large-scale material were also increasingly out of date. In 1919, Director General Charles Close, by now promoted to Brigadier, was knighted for his services in leading Ordnance Survey in war. But his 1911 vision of a revived Ordnance Survey was thwarted. In his final year in office, the Geddes Acts, a further step of additional major national austerity, meant that it would be another 18 years before moves to restore the National Survey could be put in place. In the meantime, Close appointed an artist, Ellis Martin, to design attractive map covers in an attempt to make the older, small-scale mapping look more attractive to customers. He also took a major step in transforming the recording of British landscape archaeology, with the appointment of Osbert G.S. Crawford as Ordnance Survey's first professional archaeologist. Armed with the wartime legacy of the newly developed science of aerial photography interpretation, and with an eye to scientific research and disciplined recording, Crawford became the father of modern landscape archaeology. Ellis Martin's work became synonymous with the contrasting mix of affluence, leisure, and depression, which marked the 1920s and the 1930s. Though his principal legacy of the First World War, a pair of stained-glass memorial windows inserted in the first floor of the main facade of the London Road offices, and which were made to his designs, were tragically destroyed in the 1940 Blitz. In 1970, Ordnance Survey's war dead from both World Wars were formally commemorated in a war memorial erected at the then new Romsey Road offices. This memorial, which was superseded on the move to Addernack Park, is shortly to be erected within the boundaries of the old London Road office. It is hoped that it may be possible to rededicate it on the 17th of September this year, the 100th anniversary of the first loss of an Ordnance Survey life in World War I, that of Petty Officer First Class James Henry Bear, Royal Naval Reserve.